I thought my betrothed was about to ask for my hand in marriage. That was my final foolish thought before my entire world collapsed. The grand dining hall of Crowe Manor glittered beneath the light of 100 candles the evening of Lady Seraphina Crowe's 21st birthday. Celebration! Laughter echoed across the gilded walls. Crystal glasses sparkled like captured stars. A string quartet played softly from the gallery above, their melody sweet and unhurried, the kind of music written for moments that are supposed to be remembered fondly. I remember it fondly now, just not in the way I once imagined I would. My name is Calista Voss. I was 23 years old that night, the daughter of a respected but modest gentleman who had left this world 2 years prior, taking with him most of what we owned and all of what made our small estate feel like more than 4 walls and fading wallpaper. What he left behind were his reputation, his library, and a quiet insistence that I had been raised to value the right things. I believed him. I believed a great many things that night. I believed that the man seated to my left, Kieran Vale, handsome and charming and endlessly ambitious, was everything a young woman of limited fortune and considerable hope could have wished for. I believed that the 3 years he had spent courting me meant something irreversible. I believed that when he had pressed my hand in his just the week before and whispered that he had plans, important plans, plans that concerned our future, he had meant exactly what I understood him to mean. I believed that when a man says our future, he is speaking of a shared one. That was the first thing I was wrong about. Seraphina sat across the table from me, radiant in pale gold silk, her dark hair swept up with small diamonds scattered through it like a constellation someone had arranged specifically for her. She had always been beautiful in the way that made a room rearrange itself around her, without her asking. We had been friends since we were girls of 10, sharing secrets in the Crowe garden, pressing wildflowers into the pages of borrowed books, writing each other letters so long they had to be folded 3 times to fit the envelope. I had told her everything. Every fear, every hope, every quiet confession I had ever made about Kieran, about the life I imagined, about the particular way he looked at me sometimes, that made me feel seen in a world that mostly looked past women like me. I had trusted her with all of it. That was the second thing I was wrong about. The dinner was nearing its final course when Kieran rose from his seat. The room settled the way rooms do when someone with a certain kind of confidence stands up. Conversations paused mid-syllable. Forks hovered above plates. 50 pairs of eyes turned toward him, warm and expectant, because Kieran Vale had always known how to command a room. My pulse quickened. I pressed my fingertips together beneath the table. A small velvet box rested in his hand, just visible at his side. I saw it the moment he stood. I told myself not to stare at it. I told myself to breathe. I told myself that whatever happened next, I should look composed, that I should not cry in the middle of someone else's birthday dinner, that I should not betray how desperately I wanted this. I told myself all of those things, and then Kieran began to walk. He walked away from me, not toward me, past my chair, past my shoulder, past every expectation I had carried for 3 years like something precious I was afraid to set down. The room had gone very quiet. I did not understand what was happening. I think the mind resists certain truths before the heart is ready to receive them. I think I watched him walk past me and continued for just a few seconds longer to believe I had somehow misread the direction. Then he stopped. He stopped before Seraphina. He lowered himself onto one knee, and the velvet box opened. The diamond inside caught every candle in the room. "Lady Seraphina," Kieran said, his voice clear and unhurried and utterly without hesitation. "You are the only woman I desire. Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The world did not spin. It did not tilt. It simply stopped, the way a clock stops, one moment ticking, the next perfectly, horribly still. A gasp moved through the guests like a wave. Somewhere behind me, a woman whispered something I could not hear. My hands folded so carefully in my lap had gone cold, not trembling, simply cold, as though the blood had quietly decided it was needed elsewhere. Seraphina pressed one gloved hand to her lips. Tears filled her eyes. Beautiful theatrical tears. And then she smiled. A smile I had seen 1,000 times, the smile she wore when something was going exactly as she had planned, and she extended her hand. "I shall," she said. Applause erupted around the room. Not a single soul looked at me, not one. They were all watching the diamond slide onto Seraphina's finger. They were all smiling at Kieran as he rose and kissed her cheek. They were all raising their glasses and calling out congratulations and talking over one another in the pleasant chaos of unexpected joy. And I sat perfectly still in my chair. I did not cry. I want you to know that, not because I was strong, but because I think some wounds are too precise for tears. They go too deep, too cleanly, and the body simply does not know what to do with them at first. I sat still, I breathed, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its devastation, that I had not simply lost the man I loved. I had been publicly humiliated before half the county, and Seraphina had known. She had known, and she had sat across that table from me all evening, talking and laughing and touching my arm in that familiar way she had, and she had known. That was the thing that would take the longest to forgive. Not Kieran. Kieran was simply a man who had chosen advancement over affection. That was its own kind of pain, but it was a clean pain, the kind with edges I could eventually name. Seraphina was different. Seraphina had been the keeper of every secret I owned, and she had used every one of them to understand precisely how much this would cost me. I did not know in that moment that anyone was watching me. The gallery above the ballroom was private, reserved for family and the highest nobility, rarely occupied during dinner parties. I had glanced up at it once or twice during the evening, without paying it much attention. I did not know that a man had been standing in the shadows of that gallery for the better part of an hour. I did not know that when every other eye in the room had turned toward Kieran and Seraphina, one pair of eyes had not. I did not know that Duke Alaric Edinburgh had watched the entire scene unfold, and that at the precise moment the world stopped making sense for me, he had leaned forward in the darkness above and settled his gaze on my face. I did not know any of this, but fate, as I have since learned, rarely announces itself before it arrives. If this story is already pulling you in, if you felt something when Kieran walked past her chair, subscribe now and stay with us. This is only the beginning. He had come to Crowe Manor under duress. That is the word Alaric Edinburgh would have used had anyone asked him. Duress. He was not a man who attended birthday celebrations or dinner parties or any of the social performances that the English aristocracy had elevated to, something approaching religion. He found them exhausting in the particular way that only deeply private people find them exhausting, not from shyness, but from the relentless performance of being observed. He was one of the wealthiest men in England. He was one of the least seen. The Duke of Edinburgh had inherited his title at 19, following the death of his father from a brief, unsparing illness that took the man in less than a fortnight. He had spent the years since managing the Edinburgh estates, 3 of them, spanning 2 counties, with a precision that impressed even those who disliked him, and there were several who disliked him. He was not warm. He was not charming in the way that Kieran Vale was charming. He did not fill rooms with easy laughter or offer compliments that slid off his tongue, like melted butter. What he did was watch. He had always been extraordinarily good at watching. He had come to Crowe Manor that evening because Lord Crowe had called in a favour. A business arrangement between their fathers that had never been entirely settled, and refusing Lord Crowe, while entirely within Alaric's power, would have required more social energy than simply attending. So he had come. He had been shown to the private gallery as a courtesy, given that he had made it quietly known over the years that he preferred observation to participation. A plate had been sent up, a glass of wine, the kind of arrangement that said you are welcome here, and also that your presence among us makes certain people nervous. So please watch from above. He had been watching. He had noted the guest arrangements with the detached interest of a man reviewing a document he had not requested. He had observed Lord Crowe moving through the room with the satisfied authority of a man proud of his home. He had watched Lady Seraphina hold court at the centre of the table, with the practised ease of someone who had never once in her life doubted she deserved to be at the centre. And then he had noticed the woman to Seraphina's left. She was not the most striking woman in the room. She would not have been the one that most men chose first when their eyes travelled across a gathering like this. She was quietly dressed in a gown of deep blue that suggested careful selection within modest means. Her hair was dark and simply arranged. She had the kind of face that rewarded attention, features that grew more interesting the longer you looked at them, a quality entirely unlike beauty that announced itself and demanded nothing further. She was laughing at something the gentleman beside her had said. It was a real laugh. Not the performed laughter Alaric had spent a lifetime watching women produce at dinner tables. The polite variety, the flattering variety, the variety designed to make whoever had spoken feel amusing. This was involuntary. It broke across her face before she could quite contain it, and she pressed her fingertips to her mouth in a gesture of very mild self-consciousness. Immediately afterward, he found himself watching her for reasons he could not immediately name. Then Kieran Vile rose from his seat. Alaric had not been particularly paying attention to Vale. He was the sort of man Alaric had encountered many times. Handsome in a way that required no effort, ambitious in a way that required a great deal of it, charming in a way that concealed the ambition until it no longer needed concealing. He watched Vale rise with the velvet box. He watched the woman in blue go still. He watched the precise moment her face shifted, not into grief, not yet, but into a particular suspended blankness that he recognized because he had worn it himself once, many years ago, when something he had quietly counted on had been taken away without warning. He watched her sit perfectly still through the applause. He watched her not cry. That was the thing that held him. Everyone else in the room was reacting, gasping, congratulating, laughing, toasting. The entire room was in motion, and she was utterly, completely still. Not broken, not composed in the careful way of someone suppressing emotion. Something else. Something that looked, from the gallery above, like a woman recalculating everything she had believed about the world. He stood there in the dark above the ballroom, his wine untouched, and he watched her, and he made a decision. Not about her specifically. Not yet. He was not a man who made impulsive decisions about people, any more than he made impulsive decisions about estates or investments or anything else that required long-term consideration. But he made a decision about the evening. He would not leave without speaking to her. He did not ask himself why. He had learned, at considerable personal cost, that demanding reasons from himself before acting on a certainty only slowed him down and rarely produced better outcomes. He simply knew, and knowing was enough. I left the dining room before the toasting had finished. I excused myself quietly. A headache, I said, to no one in particular, to the table at large, to the space between conversations that no one was currently occupying. A servant held the door. I passed through it without looking back. The corridor outside was cool and blessedly empty. I walked until I found a small sitting room off the eastern passage, a room I remembered from childhood visits, when Seraphina and I had used it to hide from her governess on rainy afternoons. The furniture was different now. The walls had been repapered in a pale yellow that Seraphina had once written to tell me she had chosen herself. I had written back saying it sounded lovely. I sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the dark garden. The grounds of Crowe Manor were silver with moonlight. The hedgerows cast long shadows across the lawn. In the distance, a fountain caught the light and held it, restless and moving, the only thing in the garden that refused to be still. I thought about 3 years. I thought about the way Kieran had looked at me the morning he first came to call at our estate, hat in hand, a little uncertain in that way that charming men deploy when they want to seem approachable. I thought about the walks we had taken through the fields behind our house, the letters he had written when he was in London, the particular way he said my name that had once made me feel like a woman worth saying. I thought about what it meant that he had never actually said he loved me. I searched back through 3 years of memories and found, to my extraordinary discomfort, that he had never used that word. He had said I was lovely. He had said our future together. He had said a great many things that suggested love without ever quite stating it. I had filled in the gaps myself. That, I thought, sitting in the silver dark of Seraphina's childhood sitting room, is a remarkable thing to realize about yourself. That you are capable of constructing an entire future out of implications and looks, and the warmth of a hand held correctly. There was a knock at the door. I assumed it was a servant, come to ask if I needed anything. "Come in," I said. The man who entered was not a servant. He was tall enough that he had to angle himself very slightly to accommodate the doorframe, though he did it without thinking, the unconscious adjustment of someone accustomed to moving through spaces built for smaller people. He wore evening dress of unrelieved black, and his face was one I had never seen before, though something about it was familiar in the way that certain things are familiar before you understand why. He stopped just inside the door and he looked at me. His eyes were grey. The particular grey of winter sky an hour before snow. Not cold exactly, but carrying within them the expectation of cold. And they were looking at me with an expression I could not immediately identify, because I was not accustomed to being looked at that way. Not with pity, not with curiosity exactly, with something more careful, more deliberate. "Miss Voss," he said. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage," I said. My voice was steady. I was quite proud of it. Alaric Edinburgh. The name landed quietly. I knew it, of course. Everyone knew it, in the way one knows the names of things that exist at a great remove from ordinary life. Distant weather, systems, foreign monarchs, phenomena that feel more like concepts than realities. The Duke of Edinburgh. "I was in the gallery," he said, by way of explanation. "I see. I watched what happened, yes." A pause. Most people did. Most people watched Vale. He moved to the window and stood looking out at the same garden I had been looking at. Not beside me, but near enough that I was aware of him with a precision I found somewhat inconvenient. "I watched you." The room was very quiet. "Why?" I asked. He was silent for a moment. A long moment. The kind of silence that a certain type of person uses not to avoid a question, but to be precise about the answer. "Because," he said finally, "everyone else in that room was watching a performance. You were the only person experiencing something real." I had no answer for that, so I said nothing, and he remained at the window, and I remained in my chair, and, outside the fountain, moved in its silver circle, and somewhere distant in the house, I could hear the faint sound of continued celebration. "You should know," I said at last, "that I am not in need of rescue. I know. And I am not going to weep. So if that is what brought you here, it isn't. Then what is it?" He turned from the window then, and looked at me directly, and I had the sudden unsettling sensation of being examined by someone who was very good at it, someone who had spent many years looking at things carefully and understanding what he saw. "I thought," he said, "that you might want someone to simply acknowledge what happened, without performance, without the particular brand of pity that makes the recipient feel worse than the original injury." I looked at him for a long moment. "That," I said carefully, "is a remarkably accurate assessment of what is and is not useful in a situation like this." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly. The shadow of the place a smile might eventually occupy. "I have some experience," he said, "with knowing what is and is not useful." We remained in that room for perhaps another quarter of an hour, speaking of very little that was important, and a few things that were. He did not ask me how I felt. He did not offer reassurances about Kieran or predictions about my future. He spoke of the garden below. He knew something about formal garden design, apparently, in the detached way that deeply learned people know things. And I told him about the wildflowers Seraphina, and I had once grown in a corner of this. Same garden as children, before the landscaper had been brought in and made everything symmetrical. When I rose to leave, he rose as well. "Miss Voss," he said. I turned. "You were the only dignified person in that room tonight." I thought about that on the carriage ride home. I thought about it for considerably longer than that. He called on me 3 days later, not at Crowe Manor. At Voss House, our modest home on the edge of the village, with its creaking east gate and the rose garden my mother had planted and my father had maintained, and that I now tended alone, imperfectly, with considerable affection. I was in the garden when the carriage arrived. I knew whose it was before I saw the crest. There was something about the quality of black carriages that distinguished the genuinely expensive ones from the merely aspirational, and this one had the stillness of something that had never needed to announce itself. I did not change out of my garden dress. I thought about it. Then I decided that a woman who changed her dress because an unexpected duke had arrived, at her gate had already conceded something she could not afford to concede. He was shown into the sitting room. I found him standing before my father's bookshelves, the ones I had kept even when we sold almost everything else, his hands behind his back, reading spines. "You have a complete set of Johnson," he said without turning. "My father's," I said. "He read everything twice. Once for the argument, once for the pleasure. That is an excellent system. He was an excellent man." He turned then, and looked at me in the morning light, which is a different quality of looking than candlelight allows. More revealing. Less forgiving. He did not seem troubled by it. "I have a proposition for you," he said. I sat down and gestured to the opposite chair. He sat, and for a moment arranged his thoughts with the same careful deliberateness I was beginning to recognize as simply the way he moved through the world. I require a social companion, he said, for the remainder of the season. Someone of good family and genuine intelligence who can manage the particular theatre of aristocratic gatherings without either embarrassing herself or requiring management. That is a very specific requirement. I have noticed, he said, that vague requirements produce vague results, and you believe I fit this description. I believe you are the only person I have met in recent memory who, upon receiving the worst social humiliation available in polite English society, sat perfectly still, did not cry, did not make a scene, and then spent a quarter of an hour discussing formal garden design with a stranger. I was distracted, I said. The design of that garden has always bothered me. That shadow of a smile again. I was beginning to watch for it. In return, he said, I will ensure that the social narrative surrounding your name is corrected. You will not be the woman who was abandoned by Vale. You will be the woman who is companion to the Duke of Edinburgh. Those are very different stories. He was right. They were entirely different stories. The first was a story about a woman who had been found wanting. The second was a story about a woman who had moved on to something considerably more interesting. You are offering me a social rescue, I said. I am offering you a position of strength, he corrected. There is a difference. Yes, I said. I am beginning to understand that you find distinctions important. Precision matters. In what does it not? He looked at me steadily. Most people find that question irritating. Most people are not precise enough to answer it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. There is one condition, I said. He waited. I will not pretend to be something I am not. If I am your companion for the season, I am Calista Voss, the daughter of a modest gentleman with a library and a rose garden and a recently humiliating social history. I will not perform wealth or connections I do not possess. I will not be a fiction. I would not have you be, he said. Then we are agreed. He rose, and so did I. At the door he paused, the way I was beginning to notice that he always paused before saying something he had considered carefully. Miss Voss, what I told you the other night about dignity, I meant it. What Vale and Lady Seraphina did to you was a deliberate act. It required planning and mutual concealment. You should know that before you arrive at any more charitable interpretations of their behaviour. I looked at him. I had already arrived at that conclusion, I said quietly. I know, he said. I wanted to say it aloud anyway. Some things deserve to be named. He left. I returned to my father's bookshelves and stood in front of the Johnson for a long time, not reading anything, simply thinking about a man who believed that some things deserved to be named. I thought it was possibly the most unexpectedly kind thing anyone had ever said to me. If you are still here after that, you understand exactly what this channel is built for. Hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. You will not want to miss what comes next. There are things I learned about Seraphina in the weeks that followed that I wish I had understood earlier. Not because the knowledge would have changed what happened. I do not think it would have, but because it would have changed how much of myself I gave away in the years preceding it. I learned them gradually, some from sources I would rather not specify, some from the careful observation that comes when you finally stop looking at a person through the softening lens of affection and allow yourself to see what is actually there. Seraphina had known about Kieran's intentions for some time before that evening's, not dates. She had known, and she had continued to meet me for afternoon walks, continued to write me letters full of warmth and friendly inquiry, continued to ask me how I was feeling about the upcoming proposal she knew would never come. She had sat across from me at dinner parties and watched me with eyes that held a secret that was in some essential way mine. She had told herself, I imagine, that she could not help what Kieran felt. That love, or whatever it was Kieran felt for her, which I suspect bore a closer resemblance to calculation, chose its own course, that she was not responsible for the feelings of a man she had not pursued. What she had chosen, quite deliberately, was not to tell me, not to warn me, not to allow me even the small dignity of knowing, so that I might have absented myself from that dinner, might have been anywhere else in the county on the night my heart was publicly broken before an audience of 50 people. She had chosen her entrance, and she had used my trust as the stage. I want to be fair to her memory. She was not, in every dimension of herself, a cruel person. She was a woman who had grown up believing, with some justification, that the world arranged itself around her, that what she wanted was simply a matter of wanting it clearly enough. that the people who loved her would ultimately be fine, because they had loved her, which was itself a kind of gift she had bestowed. She had never learned to reckon with the cost of that belief. She was learning it now. Because the social season had begun, and I was appearing at every significant gathering on the arm of the Duke of Edinburgh, which was the kind of story that did not merely correct a narrative. It obliterated the original one entirely. I watched Seraphina notice. At the Hartfield concert, she arrived with Kieran and immediately encountered us near the entrance. Her smile when she saw Alaric beside me required a full second longer than usual to assemble itself. "Calista," she said, her voice warm as ever. "How lovely." "Lady Seraphina," I said. "You look well." Kieran had gone somewhat pale. Alaric said nothing at all. He simply looked at Kieran Vale with the particular quality of gaze that very powerful people deploy upon very ambitious ones. Not hostile, simply measuring, and whatever Kieran found in that gaze, it was clearly not reassuring. "Your Grace," Seraphina said, turning to Alaric with her most radiant smile. "We are so pleased you could attend this evening. I don't believe we have been formally introduced." "No," Alaric said pleasantly. "We have not." He turned to me then and offered his arm. "Shall we find our seats?" We found our seats. I did not look back. But I heard very faintly the sound of Seraphina's composure straining at its seams. That was the night I understood something important about the social world I had grown up in and had always navigated with a kind of careful gratitude for whatever position it allowed me. Power in that world was not about wealth alone, or title alone, or even beauty alone. It was about the story other people told about you when you left the room. Seraphina had spent years curating that story about herself. She had spent years allowing a particular story to be told about me. What Alaric had done, by simply standing beside me in public, was hand me the authorship of my own narrative. I had not realised, until it happened, how much I had missed it. The Hartley Ball was the first time we danced. I want to be precise about this, because it matters more than it perhaps should, and I have learned from Alaric that things which matter deserve precision. We had been seen together at 5 public occasions by then. Each one had shifted the story slightly, the way a river is shifted by the patient accumulation of small changes in the bank. At the beginning of the season, I had been the woman who was humiliated at Seraphina Crowe's birthday dinner. By the 4th week, I was something considerably more interesting. The Hartley Ball was the event at which the story finally became irreversible. Lord Hartley's ballroom was vast and magnificent, the kind of room that made people feel simultaneously honoured and slightly crushed by the weight of their own smallness. Candelabra blazed from every surface. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end and played with the seriousness of musicians who understood that the quality of the music would be the last thing anyone remembered. Alaric found me near the garden doors, where I had been standing with a glass of champagne and the pleasant anonymity of someone observing, rather than participating. "You are watching people," he said. "I find people interesting. What do you find interesting about them? The distance between what they show and what they mean." He was quiet for a moment. Most people find that observation unsettling. Most people are showing something quite different from what they mean. There was a brief silence then. "Would you like to dance?" He said it in his customary way, not as a social performance, not as an obligation, but as a genuine question to which he was genuinely prepared to receive either answer. "Yes," I said. He was a good dancer. Unexpectedly so. I had imagined, for some reason I cannot now reconstruct, that a man as contained as Alaric Edinburgh would move through a waltz with the same precise economy he brought to everything else. Technically correct and slightly mechanical. He was not mechanical. He moved well, with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned something so long ago that it had left the category of skill and entered the category of nature. And he held me at exactly the right distance, not so far as to feel formal, not so close as to presume. And when he led, it was without force, the kind of leading that felt more like a shared decision than a direction. I became aware, somewhere in the second measure, that the room had noticed, not discreetly, quite openly, the Duke of Edinburgh dancing. With her. That was the story being assembled in real time by every person in the ballroom. And I could feel it being assembled, the way you can feel weather shifting before it arrives. I also became aware, in the third measure, that Kieran and Seraphina were somewhere in the room. I did not look for them. I did not need to. You are thinking about something, Alaric said, quietly enough for only me to hear. Several things. Which one is foremost? I looked up at him. He was already looking at me, which I was becoming accustomed to, the habit he had of attending to something fully rather than partially. I am thinking, I said, that I have been afraid for a very long time of being unremarkable, of being the woman that other women's stories happened around rather than to, and I am thinking that I am less afraid of it now than I was a month ago. Something happened in his expression, something I had not seen before, not the shadow of a smile, but a kind of careful openness, like a door that had been moved slightly ajar by an unplanned current. Good, he said, just that. Good. And we danced to the end of the waltz, and when it ended, he did not immediately release my hand, and I did not immediately take it back, and the room around us buzzed with the happy industry of story-making, and I found, to my complete surprise, that I did not mind at all. If something just moved in your chest reading that, that is what we come here for. Drop a comment below. Tell me where you are watching from. Every word you leave here matters to me. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was in Seraphina's handwriting. I knew it before I opened the seal. The same looping, confident script she had used to write me 10 years of letters, now directed toward me with a very different purpose. Calista, it read, I understand that circumstances have made our friendship difficult. I understand that you are angry. I want you to know that what happened was not done to hurt you. It simply happened the way these things do, and I could not control it any more than you could have. I will not apologize for loving him. I do not think you would, in my position. But I am sorry for the way you found out. That I could have managed better. I remain, as ever, your most devoted friend. Seraphina, I read it twice. Then I set it down on my writing desk and looked at it for a long time. The remarkable thing about the letter was not its cruelty. It was its sincerity. Seraphina genuinely believed what she had written. She had reframed the story so thoroughly, to herself, first, and then to me, that the deliberate concealment, the weeks of pretending, the careful deployment of my trust as a social stage had all become circumstances that had simply happened, forces beyond her control, events for which the language of apology was excessive. She had not done it to hurt me. It had simply hurt me. This, I thought, is what it looks like when someone has never been asked to fully account for themselves. Not cruelty, not even indifference, simply the complete inability to locate within one's own story the moments where a decision was made. I wrote back. I wrote the truth, not harshly, not with the sharpened edges of accumulated grievance. I wrote it the way my father had taught me to write anything important, clearly, precisely, and with respect for the persons reading it, even if that respect was not returned. I told her that I did not believe it simply happened. I told her that 3 years of shared confidence had been leveraged, and that this was a choice, regardless of what she had told herself about it. I told her that I wished her happiness, genuinely, because I was not built for sustained resentment, and carrying it served no one. And I told her that I would not be writing again. I folded the letter and sealed it, and I sent it, and I did not think about it again. That evening, Alaric came to call, as he did perhaps twice a week, never unannounced, never presumptuous, always precisely as long as was interesting and no longer. He found me in the sitting room with my father's Johnson. "You've done something today," he said, settling into the opposite chair. "Is it visible?" "Something has settled in you, something that was slightly unresolved before." I told him about the letter, about what I had written in return. He listened with the quality of attention I had come to value more than I could easily articulate. Not the performing kind, not the kind that was waiting for its turn to speak, but the real kind, the kind that meant he would remember everything I said and take it seriously. "You wrote the truth clearly," he said when I had finished. "I tried. That is not a small thing. Most people write truth with either too much anger or too much softening. Either renders it illegible. My father believed that honest things deserved honest language." "Your father," he said, "sounds like he would have been worth knowing." Something moved in my chest, something warm and slightly unsteady. "He would have liked you," I said. "He admired precision and disliked performance. Two of my more consistent qualities, I have noticed." The fire crackled between us. Outside, the evening had settled into the deep blue of late autumn dusk. In the garden, the roses had gone past their last blooming and were resting now in the particular quiet dignity of things that know they will return. "Alaric," I said. He looked at me. Why did you really come to me that night, in the sitting room at Crowe Manor? He was quiet for a moment. I told you, he said. You told me part of it. Another pause. Longer this time. I have watched people, he said carefully. For a very long time it is, as you have noticed, something I am good at. And in all that watching, I have rarely seen someone absorb something that large, that publicly, with that quality of stillness. It was. He stopped. What? It was the most honest thing I had seen in a very long time, he said quietly. In a room full of people performing various reactions to a performance, you were simply there, simply feeling it. I said nothing. I thought, he said, and this was slower, more careful, that whoever that woman was, I did not want to leave the building without having spoken to her. The fire crackled. I am glad you did not, I said. He looked at me steadily. So am I, he said. It happened on a Thursday, not dramatically, not with the sudden violence of a storm that announces itself in advance. More the way that certain truths arrive, gradually and then all at once, so that when you finally look at it directly, you cannot quite reconstruct the moment when it stopped being potential and became real. We were walking in the Edinburgh Garden, the West Garden, which he had shown me one afternoon in the third week of our arrangement, leading me through it with the quiet particular pride of someone sharing something usually kept private. It was an extraordinary garden. Wilder than I expected, less formal than Crowe's manicured grounds, less obviously controlled, more like something that had been given certain freedoms within a general understanding of where its boundaries lay. I had said so on that first visit. That is an accurate description, he had said. I find excessive control produces either submission or rebellion. Neither is ideal in a garden. Or in people, I had said. Or in people, he had agreed. Now we walked in the late afternoon light of November, which is a particular quality of light, low, golden, slightly elegiac, the light of a season that knows it is ending and has made its peace with the knowledge. I had been thinking about the arrangement. It was due to conclude at the season's end, which was approaching. We had not discussed what came after. I had not allowed myself to think about it too precisely, in the way that you avoid looking directly at certain things, because the looking would require a decision. The season ends next week, I said. Yes. Our arrangement concluded with it, as agreed. We walked a few steps further. Alaric, I said. Yes. What do you actually want? He stopped walking. I had learned by then that when Alaric Edinburgh stopped walking, it meant he was about to say something that had required considerable internal preparation. I want, he said slowly, not to end the arrangement. I looked at him. That is a very precise way of saying a great many things, I said. I am aware. Would you like to be less precise? He looked at me. The November light was in his eyes, that winter grey meeting autumn gold, and something in his face was open in a way I had seen it open only in rare moments. The night at Crowe Manor, the evening we discussed my letter, the last measure of the waltz at Hartley. I would like, he said, for you to remain at Edinburgh, not as a companion for the season. As he stopped, I said softly. As my wife, he said, if that is something you would consider. I want to be clear that it is not an obligation. It is not a continuation of an arrangement. It is Alaric. Yes, you are being very precise again. I find it difficult not to be. Then let me be imprecise for a moment, I said. I stepped toward him. I came to you in October as a woman who had just had her entire understanding of her life dismantled. I had nothing but four walls, a rose garden, and the stubborn conviction that I was worth more than what had just been done to me. You treated me as though that conviction was simply correct. Not generously, not charitably, simply correctly, as though there was no other reasonable position. His eyes had not left my face. I have not been unloved before, I said, but I have never been seen. Not like this, not with this. I searched for the word. Not with this quality of attention. As though what I actually thought and felt and said was the point, and not incidental to some other point. A long silence. Calista, he said. My name in his voice had always had a particular quality. Careful, as though it mattered how it was handled. Yes, I said. Yes. Yes, I said again. To what you asked. Whatever version of it you were going to arrive at eventually. Something broke across his face. Not dramatically, it was like watching a tide move. The same water, the same face, and yet suddenly, undeniably different. He took my hand. Not the way he had taken it at the Hartley ball, not the choreographed courtesy of a social occasion. He simply took it as though it was something he had been waiting a long time to do without occasion requiring it. I should tell you, he said, his voice slightly rough, that I have not wanted something like this in a very long time. I had concluded, with some confidence, that I was not particularly suited to wanting things like this. What changed? You walked into a sitting room, he said, in a garden dress, with soil on your gloves, because you had decided that a woman who changed for an unexpected duke had already lost something she could not afford to lose. I laughed. It was the real laugh, the involuntary one. He watched it break across my face, and something in his expression was so quietly devastated by it, in the best possible way, that I reached up and touched his face before I had quite decided to. He stilled completely. Then he covered my hand with his own and held it there. Calista, he said very quietly. Yes, I love you. 3 words, said with the same precision he brought to everything, which meant they were not said lightly or decoratively, but because they were the accurate thing, the true thing, the thing that deserved to be named. I know, I said. You know. I have been watching you for 2 months, I said. You are very precise, and everything you do precisely has pointed in one direction. He laughed then. A full laugh, unexpected, surprised out of him by what I had said, and it transformed his face completely, that winter-grey seriousness breaking open into something warm and a little helpless and entirely, utterly real. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I love you, I said, and in the November garden, with the last light of autumn falling across us both, that was enough. The season ended. The arrangement did not. What replaced it was quieter, less socially legible, and considerably more important. We were married in February, in the chapel on the Edinburgh estate, with a small gathering that included my mother, 2 of Alaric's closest associates, Mrs. Henning, his housekeeper of 15 years, and the retired vicar who had christened Alaric as an infant, and seemed deeply pleased to be officiating at a ceremony that he called overdue. There was no social performance. There were no 50 guests. There was no glittering audience assembled to witness anything. There was simply a chapel and February light, and 2 people making promises they meant precisely. Kieran Vale and Lady Seraphina were married in March. The society pages reported it as the wedding of the season. Enormous guest list, spectacular flowers, a reception that lasted until dawn. I read about it in the newspaper over breakfast. Does it hurt? Alaric asked, watching me. Less than I expected, I said honestly. Less than it would have, I think, if none of the rest of this had happened. Good. I do not wish them unhappiness, I said, folding the paper. I simply find that I have stopped caring what they wish. Alaric looked at me across the breakfast table, our breakfast table, in the morning room that now contained a vase of roses I had transplanted from Voss House and a shelf of my father's books and a reading chair I had chosen, and said quietly, "That is precisely the right distance." It was, I would discover, the beginning of what became true. Kieran's ambitions outpaced Seraphina's wealth within 2 years. His business ventures, which had always been slightly more optimistic than rigorous, encountered the reality that optimism without foundation is simply delay. By the 3rd year of their marriage, there were rumours. By the 4th, the rumours had a certain specificity about them that suggested they were no longer rumours. Seraphina, I heard from my mother, had grown quieter. Not contentedly quiet, the other kind. I thought about that sometimes. Not with satisfaction. I was not built for satisfaction at another person's unhappiness, even one who had wronged me. But with a kind of clear, unsentimental acknowledgement of how the world actually works, when the performance concludes and the daily reality of a choice becomes apparent. She had chosen a man because he was charming and ambitious and handsome. She had gotten all 3. She had not accounted for what charm and ambition and handsomeness look like from the inside over time, when the novelty has worn away and what remains is simply the character of the person you have bound yourself to. I had not chosen charm or ambition or handsomeness. I had chosen a man who believed precision mattered and that some things deserved to be named, and that a woman who kept soil on her gloves for the right reasons deserved to be looked at directly. On a morning in our 2nd spring at Edinburgh, I was in the West Garden, which had become partly my garden by then. I had introduced roses into its wilder sections, a negotiation between my inclinations and its existing character that I found deeply satisfying. When Alaric came to find me, he stood at the gate and looked at me kneeling in the dirt, and said nothing for a moment. "You are happy," he said, not a question. "Yes," I said. He was quiet. "Are you?" I asked. He came through the gate and crouched down beside me in the dirt in his perfectly good coat, without apparent concern for it, and looked at the roses I was placing. "These need more sun," he said. "I know. I am giving them what this section has. They will adapt. Things generally do when they are given what they actually need." He looked at me. "Yes," he said. "I am." I reached over and took his hand, dirty glove against clean coat, and he let me, and we stayed like that for a while in the spring garden, with the morning light coming in sideways and warm, and the roses making their slow, quiet progress toward what they were going to become. I thought about the night of Seraphina's birthday, the candlelight, the applause, the 50 people watching someone else's story, and none of them watching mine. I thought about how certain it had felt, in those first cold moments, that I had lost everything. I thought about how wrong certainty can be. And I thought about a man in a gallery above a ballroom who had watched the entire room look away from me, and had looked at me instead, and had thought, whatever it was he had thought, something that brought him through a door I had not known I was sitting behind. Dignity, he had called it. He had been right. What I had not understood then, sitting in that chair with my cold hands and my unspent tears, was that dignity was not merely something you preserved in the face of disaster. It was the thing that, if you kept it carefully enough, eventually led the right person directly to you. The garden was quiet around us. The roses reached toward the light, and I stayed where I was, and held on to what I had found, and did not look back at all. We are almost at the end now. If Calista's story has felt like something you needed tonight, subscribe and share it with someone who deserves to hear it. These stories exist for you. What remains, I have learned, is always more than what was lost. Not immediately. Not in the first days when the loss is the only thing large enough to see. Not even in the weeks after, when you are still measuring your life by the shape of the absence. But eventually, always eventually. I think about the woman I was at 23, sitting in a chair in a borrowed sitting room with cold hands and a composure borrowed from somewhere deeper than I knew I possessed. I think about what she believed, that her future had been the one she imagined, that her story was already written, that the difference between having what you want and having what you need is merely a matter of deserving it clearly enough. She was wrong about most of it. She was right about one thing. She was worth more than what had been done to her. That was the thing she held on to in the dark of that night. That was the thread she did not let go of, even when everything else unraveled. Not bitterness, not rage, not the particular steel of a woman sharpening herself into a weapon against those who wronged her. Simply the quiet, stubborn insistence that she was worth more. And that insistence, that small, unglamorous refusal to accept the story she had been handed, was what Duke Alaric Edinburgh had seen from the gallery above. Not her pain, not her beauty, not her social position or her connections or any of the currencies that society assembled into worthiness. Her refusal, her absolute, unhurried refusal to collapse. He had loved that before he knew her name. I know this because he told me so. On a night in our 3rd year when the candles were low and the fire was warm, and we had been talking for a long time about nothing in particular and everything that mattered. "What did you see?" I had asked him. "What exactly did you see?" He thought for a long time. "I saw a woman who had just been given every reason to become smaller," he said, "who was choosing, very quietly, not to." I was silent. "Most people," he said, "when the world reduced them, accept the reduction. Not angrily, not consciously. They simply begin to take up less space, to want less, to expect less, until eventually the reduced version of themselves feels like the original." He paused. "You did not do that." "I did not feel like I was making a choice," I said. "I was simply sitting still. That was the choice." Outside our window, the Edinburgh grounds lay under the quiet of a winter night. In the morning there would be frost on the west garden. The roses would be sleeping. The fountain would be stilled. I looked at the man beside me, this precise, private, surprisingly warm man who had watched the world perform for years from the careful distance of someone who had stopped expecting to be surprised, and had then been surprised anyway, by a woman in a blue dress, sitting still, in a borrowed room. "I love you," I said. "I know," he said. "That is what I said." "Yes," the shadow of a smile, the real kind. "I learned it from someone who said it first." I laughed. He pulled me closer. And the night settled around us, warm and unhurried, full of the particular peace that belongs to people who have stopped waiting for their life to Begin and have noticed with some pleasure that it already has. Some stories do not begin with happiness. They begin with the loss of something you thought was happiness, and the discovery, on the other side of that loss, of what happiness actually is. It is quieter than expected. It does not announce itself. It arrives in a man who takes your dirty gloved hand without complaint, in a garden that is partly yours by now, in a morning that is simply a morning and is enough. It arrives in being seen, really seen, for the first time, by the only person who was watching. If this story found you tonight, if something in Calista's refusal to collapse felt familiar, if something in Alaric's quiet devotion moved through you, like a thing you have been waiting to feel, then you already know why this channel exists. These stories are for women who have been passed over, looked past, underestimated. Women who held their dignity when there was every reason not to. Women who kept the thread, even in the dark. If that is you, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you. Was it the chair in the sitting room? The waltz? The November garden? The hand held without occasion? Every story I tell here is for you, and there are so many more waiting.